Governor Roy Cooper faced protesters at a recent meeting of what's called the Climate Change Interagency Council. That's really just a fancy name for the state panel that's been tasked with meeting the governor's goal of transitioning North Carolina to what he calls a clean energy economy. So what does that really mean? Don Vaart has an answer for that. He is the senior fellow with the Locke Foundation, also the former secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality under Governor Pat McCrory. Don, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So the governor had his big meeting, and there were protesters outside. Now, one would just, in general, think that environmentalists would be with the governor's plan to go to a clean energy economy. So what were the protesters upset with the governor about?
Well, as best I can tell, there were a number of issues, and some of them had to do with the governor's apparent support for expanded use of natural gas, which new research has indicated may in fact not be as good for preventing global warming as previously thought. Then there were also concerns about the continued manufacture and expanded manufacturing of wood pellets for use especially in Europe, for combustion under the guise of it being carbon neutral, which most scientists would disagree with. And then, of course, they wanted more solar and more wind. And it's not clear who wants more of that. They both say they want more.
Don, the governor's plan essentially calls for two things. He says he wants to modernize the electric grid, and also he wants to reduce our use of fossil fuel energy. So that on its face sounds like, hey, good ideas, but what do you say?
That's actually a bit of an oxymoron. What he wants to modernize the grid for is to allow more solar, more intermittent sources, which are difficult to integrate. And right now we're sort of at the limit of that. So he wants to improve the grid so that would accommodate more solar. But that's essentially saying we want more natural gas, because you can't have solar power added onto your grid without having the requisite backup natural gas combustion turbines. And that's simply the fact. So if you want more solar, you want more natural gas. And again, I think I'm a little sympathetic to the protesters. The increased use of natural gas now, according to new research coming out of both Cornell and Duke here in North Carolina, indicates that the various steps of natural gas production and transportation leads to significant emissions of methane, the primary component of natural gas. Methane, in turn, is a very powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than CO2. And these researchers opine that the increased use of natural gas, in fact, is tantamount to adding a coal-fired unit. There is a disagreement here. The Department of Environmental Quality uses older numbers, an older approach. Essentially, you would agree with Cornell and with the Duke professor if you believe the climate change crisis, if you will, is in the next 20 years more important, or you would agree with the Department of Environmental Quality if you think it's much, much longer than that. And I think that was a major part of the protest.
Don, as we learn more and more research is done into not just fossil fuels, which we know a lot about, but also these so-called renewable sources that have become so popular not only with the public, but also in public policy in terms of subsidies, tax credits, etc. Right. But we seem to be learning that to every type of energy source, there are pros and there are cons. There is really no panacea.
Certainly that's true with intermittent sources like solar and wind. The problems we're facing, that Duke is facing, in integrating these intermittent sources is going to lead to a very costly fix, that is to modernize the grid. What we are missing, I think, is the very important component of nuclear power. And we need to, before we spend more money on solar and wind, we need to very seriously talk about, number one, to incentivize the continued use of our existing nuclear plants, and we need to have the conversation about building new nuclear plants.
One would think that people who identify themselves as environmentalists and are so concerned about greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, etc., that they would love nuclear power because it is zero emissions. But most of them don't. But you say that in the scientific community, it's a different view.
If you look at the serious, what I think, serious environmentalists, you'll see support for nuclear power. Look, the question you raise is a very good one, which is, on the one hand, you hear people wanting more solar, which means more natural gas. And I'm arguing, and others are arguing, for more nuclear. Let's consider this. What if we add a 30% increase in our load due to having everyone drive electric vehicles, something that Governor Cooper very much says he wants? Under the current grid and under the current policies, that 30% increase is going to be met with primarily natural gas. So you'll see an increase in the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted for a shift to electric vehicles that Governor Cooper and others claim is actually going to benefit our environment. On the other hand, if we put that off and concentrate on keeping our nuclear plants going, getting them relicensed, and beginning construction on new nuclear, you're going to ultimately lead to a place where electric vehicles might make sense.
I think the discussion of EVs is really interesting because you will hear some supporters say, look, there's nothing coming out of the tailpipe. But you have written about this. What about the other side of that?
Well, right. I mean, I think any serious adult knows that you're simply shifting the emissions from the tailpipe to a nearby steam station, whether it's a coal-fired steam station or a natural gas plant. Those emissions are coming out. And I think what's important to remember is that these units, these electric vehicles, aren't any more efficient than our gasoline engines, and we really need to go slowly before we jump into a massive nationwide incentive program to have us drive those vehicles.
We often talk about the stakeholders in different areas of public policy. The big stakeholder, that would be those of us who have to pay electric bills, pretty much everybody. We don't get talked about a whole lot. And so I'd like to get your thoughts in terms of energy policy about the differences in these types of sources and what they cost, and ultimately the impact on that electric bill that comes in the mail or that you pay through your bank draft once a month.
It is so true that most of the so-called stakeholders are special interest groups. There is very little representation of the ratepayer as such, and the kind of sources we're talking right now, the cheapest electricity on our grid is existing nuclear plants. That's the cheapest there is. That's what Duke dispatches first. But so often when we talk about solar, they neglect the costs of the natural gas plant that has to come with the solar fields. And those costs combined are very high indeed. We're seeing our rates go up, and recently Duke just asked to increase their rates, much of which is caused by the renewable energy increase.